The stories. Paramedic who returned a ring to the ranger station. He found the ring beneath a bench outside the ranger station after a thunderstorm cleared and left everything smelling like pennies. The inscription was shallow from wear, yet legible enough to stop him cold before he tossed it in Lost and Found. His name was Daryl Keene, 32, paramedic on the rural night unit that parked near the station between calls. He had clocked out late and planned to drive home for eggs and sleep, nothing heavier than traffic and weather. The ring was small, silver, scuffed, with 4 letters etched inside that did not match any brand he recognized. He wiped it on his shirt, felt ridiculous superstition prickle his neck, then reminded himself that metal was just metal. He walked into the station lobby where the maps curled at the edges and flyers begged hikers to sign trail registers. The clerk on duty that morning was a seasonal hire named Isabel Rusk, 26, wildlife biology graduate and coffee loyalist. She wrote the ring in the inventory ledger, asked his phone number for a courtesy call, and slid it into a tray. Dario left a note by instinct, a paramedic habit, logging time and location and weather in case someone asked later. Out in the parking lot, he replayed last night, which featured a stranded camper with mild hypothermia and a false alarm. He could not shake the ring, which was strange, because he usually forgot objects once they were filed and numbered. On his day off, he cut through town for groceries and noticed a poster at the laundromat that mentioned a missing ring. The page was sun-warped and stapled crooked, with a photocopied hand and the same 4 letters circled in black pen. The contact tear slip was gone, but a name remained that matched an old Ranger call sign he knew from dispatch. He remembered hearing it during training, tucked into an anecdote about a search several winters before he joined the unit. Back at his apartment, he opened a plastic tote where he kept spiral notebooks filled with patient notes and road observations. He used them to steady his head when night shifts stacked up and details blurred into one long siren-haunted ribbon. He flipped through a winter notebook and found an entry about a storm closure at the North Ridge trailhead near mile marker. There was a scribble about a reported vehicle in the lot after midnight, and a reference to archived calls marked cold case. The 4 letters matched the poster and the notebook, and his stomach tightened like he had stepped into empty air unexpectedly. He told himself it was coincidence. Then he looked again at the handwriting and knew he would not sleep without checking. He drove to the station and asked for Isabel, who had just come off trail crew support and smelled faintly like pine cleaner. She retrieved the tray, confirmed the ledger entry, and admitted that the ring already drew a call from a withheld number. The caller reportedly asked whether the inscription was intact, then hung up when she offered the standard lost property procedure. Isabel shrugged and said weird things find the station every year, then asked why he looked like he had swallowed a tack. Daryl explained the poster and his notes, careful with phrasing, avoiding names and exact dates that might tag private people. He asked whether the old Ranger call sign meant anything to her, and she frowned like a person trying to remember a ringtone. She typed on a terminal that still beeped like an old cash register and pulled up a thin incident summary from past seasons. The report mentioned a volunteer ranger named Lyle Witt, mid-40s, seen last signing out to check a flooded culvert. Witness statements suggested he turned off the main road to assist a motorist in a heavy rain that erased tire tracks. Final footage from a highway maintenance camera showed headlights near the ridge turnout, then heavy static as wind battered the lens. The 4 letters in the ring inscription matched his initials and a nickname the volunteer used on old trail day signboards. The summary ended with a note that the vehicle and the volunteer were not recovered despite grid searches and river scans. Daryl felt the room narrow, which happened to him on difficult scenes when he needed to pick the next useful action. He asked whether they ever collected personal property from that area, and Isabel said most recovered items turned up much later. She added that spring melt exposes things that winter hides, and lost metal often travels far in culverts and channels. Daryl asked to sign a witness statement, which felt strange, since his only act had been bending for a glint under a bench. He described the find with plain details, like distance from the threshold and position of the bench slats and water stains. He included the weather and the timestamp from his phone, then he photographed the ledger page with permission for his records. On his way out, he noticed a corkboard with dryer lint textures of flyers, including one about historic flood years and culvert maintenance. A little printed square described a storm nearly 20 years back that undercut the ridge road and formed a temporary sinkhole. The line about road repairs matched a rumor he had heard on overnight radio, the sort of thing callers debate between traffic updates. He took a photo of the square and wrote down the maintenance contact number, then drove home feeling like the ground rode along. That evening, he called the maintenance office and reached a supervisor named Raleigh Dim, 51, veteran of patchwork and paperwork. Raleigh remembered the volunteer by call sign and said the guy reportedly once welded a broken gate hinge on his lunch hour. He explained that the ridge turnout drained into a service culvert that emptied into an old arroyo behind a shuttered campground. He added that a private tow company once pulled an abandoned sedan from a side basin during late summer, then misplaced the paperwork. Daryl asked whether the county kept disposal receipts, and Raleigh said archived bills lived in a warehouse that smelled like motor oil. He offered to meet the next morning with access to the paper stacks if Daryl did not mind dust and swearing at faded ink. They met in a low building whose metal roof pinged when gulls landed, and Raleigh rolled out a ladder and a cart with binders. Daryl paged through invoices and found a line item for a recovered vehicle from the ridge vicinity after a storm year. The receipt lacked a plate number, which set his teeth on edge, but it listed a description that matched the volunteer's truck. A handwritten note in the margin directed the tow company to hold personal effects for a claim that never arrived or cleared. Daryl used his phone to scan the page, then asked Raleigh whether the side basin ever got dredged for heavy debris after storms. Raleigh nodded and said they tried, but the basin had pockets where things settled deep and stayed quiet until a new season. Back at the station, Isabel took the scanned receipt and added it to a folder that had begun to resemble a small case file. She called the number from the old poster just in case, and it rang to a voicemail that no longer accepted messages. They agreed not to speculate out loud, which is how responsible people hold a line between curiosity and harm to private families. Instead, they requested access to dispatch logs from that storm week, using internal email channels and precise language about inventory continuity. The logs showed multiple calls reporting a stalled vehicle and disappearing taillights near the ridge turnout around the same time. One archived call captured a voice asking if the station had a spare chain, then cutting out as thunder rolled over everything. Daryl listened and felt a human scale of time, the way a minute expands when weather takes over and simple plans collapse. He thought about why the ring would end up under the bench unless someone placed it, then pictured stormwater spreading like a net. Isabel checked the station exterior and found a grill over a drain that emptied near the bench after long downhill runs. She traced the channel on the maintenance map and saw a path from the arroyo through a culvert that cut beneath the parking lot. It sounded improbable at first, then they considered how small objects ride water differently than larger debris during heavy flow. A ring could slip past grates like a coin tossed to luck, then settle where turbulence died and janitors swept after hours. They walked the route during daylight and marked scuff lines from past flows, following pebbles like breadcrumbs to the station edge. At a low grate, they found a snag of twigs and a strip of cloth that might be from a work shirt pocket. Isabel bagged the cloth and labeled it for possible testing, though neither expected much, and both respected quiet possibilities. They logged locations and took photos from eye level and boot level, then stored everything in the folder that felt heavier daily. That night, a withheld number called the station again and left a message that asked whether the initials were still visible. The voice sounded older and careful, and the caller reportedly asked about stainless versus silver, then thanked someone who had not answered. Daryl suspected a relative who wanted privacy, so he did not push for a callback through caller lookup that might bruise boundaries. Instead, he asked Isabel to post a simple notice that an item was found, with identification proof required and no description. 3 days later, a woman arrived with wind-bitten cheeks and an envelope of photocopies of Trail Day signboards and old photos. She introduced herself as Marnie Witt, 50, postal clerk, and said she believed the ring belonged to someone she once knew. She produced a photocopy of a volunteer roster with initial marks that matched the inscription style and the spacing between letters. She also brought a scanned image of a birthday photo reportedly taken at the station picnic where the ring first appeared on a hand. Isabel followed procedure, asked neutral questions, and requested a description without revealing any difference between steel and silver. Marnie said it was silver and scuffed from manual work, and the letters were done with a cheap engraving pen from a hardware counter. She had no interest in press or drama, only closure regarding a box of things that never found a rightful shelf at home. She did not ask about remains or rumors, and the room felt like a church hallway, with voices quietly minding the floor echo. Daryl watched her study the ring like a person watching weather, accepting change without bargaining. Then she nodded and held it close. She signed the claim form and thanked them for record keeping, then said she planned to take the ring to a quiet spot and breathe. After she left, Daryl and Isabel sat silently with a folder that could be closed even without answers that win headlines. They updated the file with non-identifying language, noting that the event remained unresolved, but an item found its probable keeper. A week later, Raleigh called to say the warehouse yielded another stack of toe slips that linked the earlier receipt to a dated work order. The order referenced a truck pulled from a side basin near the arroyo, with no occupant listed and disposal recorded after waiting periods. Daryl printed the work order and attached it to the file, then suggested a courtesy memo to the county records office for alignment. The memo included excerpts from dispatch logs, witness statements, and the inventory ledger, written plainly, without speculation or sharp claims. He drove to the turnout that evening and parked where the wind rolled downhill like a waterless river over dry grass. He stood by the newly repaired grate and imagined a ring skipping through stormwater, then settling under a bench as the world dried. On the way back, he stopped at the laundromat and saw the old poster had been removed, the staple holes still marking the cork. He felt relief and something else that did not have a tidy name, a feeling like finishing a call without losing anyone. At the station, Isabel had taped a small note above the lost and found that read, "Inventory matters, please describe details patiently." Daryl smiled because he knew how patience saved lives on ugly roads and how tiny facts often carried heavy conclusions silently. He wrote a final entry in his notebook that summarized the chain of events, using timestamps and neutral phrasing like a field report. He listed his own doubts and how they changed, which he did after tough nights, so future him remembered the shape of useful doubt. He drove home and fried eggs and left the radio off, letting the quiet fill in around the edges of the long day. In the morning, he returned to duty and checked his ambulance kit twice, then a third time, because routine confidence keeps hands steady. News never broke big from the ridge, and that felt right, because families deserve weathered truths without strangers guessing for sport. The station kept the folder in a locked cabinet with a slip that directed any future inquiry to records with gentle formality. When Daryl parked near the bench again, he looked at the drain and thanked the design that nudged a small thing into daylight. He also thanked the habit of writing things down, because memory can bend when nights are long and calls stack like restless waves. He knew the ring did not fix the story, yet it tightened the edges enough to hold, like stitching on a torn sleeve. He decided that returning it mattered regardless of headlines, because care can look like a metal circle resting in a palm. Later, a storm rolled across the hills and the station roof hammered, but the grate held and the lot drained without drama. Daryl watched the water pass the bench and felt steadier than the week before, which is a kind of quiet rescue in itself. He thought about that last highway camera clip that cut out as wind rose, and he hoped the driver knew someone kept looking. He believed that simple custody of small objects carried weight, and he promised himself to keep taking notes when the world blurred. The next week, a handwritten thank you arrived with no return address, just a single sentence about holding grief like a stone. Isabel logged the letter, then placed it in the file where it settled beside receipts and call logs and dry photographs. They closed the cabinet gently, like leaving a campsite clean, and the station returned to business with maps and radios humming. Daryl stepped outside, breathed air that smelled like wet bark, and felt awake enough to meet the next ordinary emergency. He walked past the bench and saw nothing shine, and that unremarkable view felt right, like a road that finally held its line. The man who knocked on every door in Pine Hollow. Neighbors in Pine Hollow reported a quiet man who moved methodically along Oak Ridge Drive after sunset and knocked once. Deputies logged several calls that week, yet no report identified the man by name or vehicle. The pattern ended abruptly on a rainy Thursday, and the gaps in the record began to matter. The first documented account came from Wasco County dispatch logs, which noted a single knuckle rap at 1912, followed by silence. A resident stated the man stood at the threshold, hands visible, head tilted slightly, and then stepped away. The resident described a canvas jacket without insignia, worn boots, and a square envelope held flat against his chest. Deputies were sent to canvass the street, and the man was reportedly gone before units arrived. The primary witness, Daniel Kerr, age 47, gravel truck driver, said he noticed the man returning 2 nights later near the closed marina. Daniel waited in his idling pickup, watched the man approach a darkened porch, and knock once without speaking. He saw no exchange through the glass, only a porch light flicking on and off, then the man moving to the next house. Daniel's statement was placed in the county file from 2009, and the handwriting appears tense and compact. A second account came from Leah Morton, age 59, substitute teacher, who walked her dog along the cul-de-sac after dinner. Leah reported the man carried no phone, wore no hat, and kept his eyes level with the door viewer. She noticed how he checked the upper corners of the frame as if counting staples, then folded the envelope tighter under his arm. Investigators never confirmed the envelope's contents, and records conflict on its color. State records show a property tax dispute on Oak Ridge Drive that same month, naming 3 parcels with unpaid assessments and an appeal pending. The appeal file lists a former survey technician, last known address outside the Dalles, who had worked boundary lines across irrigation easements. Some locals claimed the technician had returned to challenge a fence line, although there is no letter on file supporting that claim. The assessor's office released redacted notes, and the names do not match the dispatch entries. Archived notes from the Pine Hollow Volunteer Fire Station mention porch cameras that failed to capture clear frames during the week of calls. One entry states that a resident's motion light pulsed once, then stayed dark despite a fresh bulb and verified wiring. Another entry states that a door chime rang without a knock, although the owner admitted the chime sometimes rang during wind gusts. Investigators never confirmed a power issue beyond routine outages common on stormfront days. When deputies finally performed a coordinated evening walkthrough, the man reportedly shifted routes and used the lake road toward the bait shop. A clerk recalled a customer who bought coffee and asked whether mail still reached houses at the top of the ridge. The clerk could not specify the day, and the receipt tape for that window was already binned with cardboard. The detail about mail service was later flagged in the county file, though no follow-up appears in margin notes. A pattern emerged in the statements gathered by a junior investigator whose name is smudged in the photocopy header. Houses that received a knock often had handwritten notes taped inside the peephole, visible only from the hallway when the door closed. Several residents denied placing the notes, stating they never tape instructions near the chain, latch, or viewer. The notes are not preserved in evidence, and their wording is reconstructed from interviews made days later. One homeowner, Victor Ellis, age 63, retired millwright, said his note read, "Leave parcels at side gate," scrawl pressed hard into the paper. He told deputies he never writes delivery instructions since he meets drivers at the carport. Victor's niece, who visited that evening, said the paper looked old and brittle, with faint grid lines under the pencil marks. Investigators never confirmed the source of the paper, and lab submission forms were never filed. A door manufacturer from the Dalles reviewed the reports and suggested a different angle after reading the archived notes. He said a single controlled knock can test the door's hang, its weather strip seal, and the position of the latch tongue. The detail interested the assessor's office, which had previously measured door sets for code compliance during a flood mitigation grant. Investigators never confirmed that the man performed any inspection work, and no invoice appears in state records. On the 4th night, rain tracked along the lake road and gathered in shallow ruts below the cottonwoods near the culvert. Tire marks branched toward the closed campground, though the gate chain hung straight and unbroken when the deputy checked. A bait bucket sat on the picnic table, lid clamped tight, no name written on the plastic rim. The deputy's body cam records a distant knock across the water, yet the timestamp shows a gap during the crucial minute. Leah said she later found a folded map inside her storm door, not sealed, edges damp, street grid drawn in felt tip lines. The map circles 3 houses on her block, including her own, and one small mark near the mailbox cluster. She turned the map over to the volunteer station, where it stayed on a corkboard under thumbtacks until the cleaning day. There is no scan of the map in the county file from 2009, and its chain of custody is uncertain. Some locals claimed the man used an old meter reader route and followed hydrant spacing to match lot boundaries along the ridge. Others said he was a process server who refused to speak in case a door camera captured the wrong introduction. A process server out of Portland denied any contract in Pine Hollow, although the business address had changed since the inquiry. The utility company provided a general statement about discontinued walking routes, and no roster shows the man's name. 2 weeks after the first call, a holiday light strand appeared across several porches on the upper bend near the empty lot. The strand was wired through existing hooks, as if measured in advance by someone who knew the spacing. Residents assumed a neighbor helped, then realized the plugs sat 2 inches short of every outlet by the same small margin. Investigators never confirmed who strung the lights, and the strand vanished before the next rain moved through. A ranger from Wasco County described seeing footprints that began at the culvert and ended cleanly at the asphalt, no gravel drag. He mentioned a habit common to inspectors who step carefully to avoid leaving debris on a finished surface. The remark was noted by the junior investigator, who annotated the margin with a short underline near the word habit. There is no supplemental report explaining why the underline mattered, and the review ended before winter. The final reported knock came on a Thursday when the lake wind shifted and carried wood smoke down from the ridge. Daniel said the man stood at the last dark porch and waited 20 seconds, then leaned forward as if listening. Daniel saw the envelope held flat again, edges softened by damp and a corner bending toward the man's thumb. When the porch light blinked, the man lowered his head, tapped the doorframe once, and left the envelope on the rail. The envelope recovered from the rail contained a single sheet with printed rows labeled parcel, line, and correction, followed by blanks. The sheet bore no letterhead, only smudged blueprint from an office printer that misfed often during cold mornings. The blanks suggest a form intended for later entries, not a message meant for the household at that address. Investigators never confirmed which parcels were under review, and the assessor's office closed its appeal log without amendment. Several residents reported silence after the Thursday route, and no further knocks reached dispatch for the rest of the month. Leah said the dog still paused at each stoop, nose close to the weather strip, as if catching a faint chemical tang. Daniel said the campground gate started to squeal with a high note even when nobody touched the chain. The notes on file mention these sensory details, and the phrasing avoids conclusions about what caused them. 2 summers later, a real estate flyer listed 3 homes on Oak Ridge Drive with corrected boundary descriptions in small print. The flyer's map aligns with the felt-tip circles Leah described, though the streets were redrawn after minor subdivision updates. A title officer said those corrections can follow old survey notes that never reached the public plat books at the time. Investigators never confirmed whether the man's envelope related to those adjustments, and the county file closes without resolution. By the time the volunteer station cleared its corkboard, the map was gone, and the thumbtacks left 2 pale sun marks. The bait shop clerk said the coffee buyer never returned, and the receipt boxes cycled into new weeks without any preserved slips. Neighbors still watch the ridge when the wind drops, and the lake carries sound across the culvert in a clean line. The man reportedly knocked on every door in Pine Hollow, yet no record shows who he was or why he measured those thresholds. The stories. This highway turnout kept a missing trucker's toll receipt. The turnout sits between scrub pines and a wind-blown ditch, and it held a toll receipt longer than anyone realized. The receipt came from a night when a driver stopped for 6 quiet minutes, then disappeared beyond the concrete barriers. Dorian Hale worked highway maintenance for the county, age 37, and he took pride in simple, measurable things. His Thursday assignment was routine line checks, with a side errand to clear debris from an overflow grate near the eastbound turnout. The morning felt ordinary as he idled the orange pickup, sipped gas station coffee, and clipped a laminated checklist to his clipboard. He pulled on gloves, set cones, then walked the shoulder counting reflective posts, and he hummed a tune he could not place. At the turnout, he knelt by the grated culvert, where stray plastic and crushed cans made a soggy stripe against rusted mesh. A folded paper showed only a blue stripe and a timestamp smudged by rain. The paper was stiff, thin, and heat-printed, the kind used at toll plazas that still handed cash change. He eased it open with a screwdriver tip, read a plaza name he recognized, and traced a time almost exactly 2 years back. The fare matched a commercial axle count, and a faint pen mark read Brandt in shaky block letters. Dorian knew the surname because his father still kept a clipped article about a driver named Silas Brandt. The story said a veteran hauler left a warehouse near midnight, then failed to deliver a load of drywall and never returned calls. Investigators canvassed truck stops, pulled camera footage, and searched an exit ramp pond where a guardrail once stood bent. The county replaced that rail within a week, and Dorian helped pour the new anchors under a bitter early spring sky. He remembered the way troopers scanned the water with side-scan gear, and he remembered a family photo taped to a utility pole. The picture showed a smiling man with deep crow feet lines, wearing a ball cap shaped by years of Sunday. He set the receipt on the warm truck hood, and he felt a nervous pull he did not want to ignore. He radioed dispatch for a non-emergency inquiry, explained he found what looked like a toll slip, and requested guidance from the patrol office. The operator took his badge number, logged the time, and said an investigator would call once she could review the old case file. The call came after lunch from an investigator named Fenna Ortiz, who spoke carefully but asked direct questions. She confirmed the surname matched the missing driver, and she asked Dorian to secure the paper in a clean envelope. She told him to keep working as usual because she needed to check archived calls and bridge camera timestamps before driving out. He locked the receipt in a plastic map pouch, finished the great work, then walked the turnout with a slower, sharper eye. The asphalt showed faint striations where heavy rigs often idled, and a single bolt head gleamed bright against dull gravel. A cracked mirror shard lay half buried near the weeds, reflecting a tuft of cloud that moved like something alive. He logged the shard as debris, snapped a photo with a timestamp, and saved it among his maintenance images from earlier weeks. The images, he realized, showed the same corner of concrete week after week, and the corner looked slightly cleaner today. That thought returned him to the culvert, where the receipt had been wedged behind a lip most drivers never noticed. The patrol cruiser pulled up near too, and Investigator Ortiz stepped out carrying a clipboard and a small camera. She was mid-40s, concise, and she asked for the sequence from his arrival to the moment he opened the folded paper. He described the gloves, the screwdriver tip, the awkward angle at the grate, and the exact place where the paper caught. She photographed the culvert, the hood of his truck, and his gloves, then placed the receipt in a fresh evidence sleeve. She asked whether he had heard of any scavengers or roadside sellers who might pick through turnouts in quiet hours. He shook his head and mentioned night fishermen at the quarry road and a retired lineman who walked his dog near dawn. Ortiz had already checked dispatch logs from the night Silas vanished, and those logs showed 2 calls near that turnout. One came from a motorist reporting a stalled box truck on the shoulder, which cleared itself before a trooper arrived. The second came from a bridge camera technician, noting a brief outage around 2:12, which was dismissed as routine. She asked permission to pull Dorian's maintenance photos, the ones covering every week around the 2-year mark. He agreed without hesitation and forwarded the entire folder, even the blurry shots he usually deleted at the office. Ortiz scrolled methodically, then paused on an image taken exactly 3 days after the reported outage at the bridge camera. The photo showed the same culvert, same weed line, and a crumpled label half hidden under wet pine needles. Ortiz zoomed until the pixels blurred, then noted a fragment that looked like the corner of a toll slip. She compared that week to the next, where the culvert looked cleaner, then to the next, where more wind-blown trash filled the grid again. Dorian pointed toward the bright bolt he noticed earlier, which did not appear in his older photos at all. Ortiz crouched and confirmed the bolt was new stainless, fixed through a small angle bracket that sat flush to the curb. She said the bracket was not standard for that guardrail style, and it looked like something installed to anchor a temporary brace. They walked the rail from cone to cone, and she stopped at a spot where the soil sloped into a greasy black ribbon. The smell suggested old brake dust and gear oil, and the vegetation showed a flattened path that looked more deliberate than random. She made a note to have a canine unit sweep the embankment later, and she radioed for a drone with a thermal camera. Across the turnout, a small convenience store faced the service road, and a metal bell chimed when the door opened. The clerk on duty was a woman named Karen Duplessis, age 29, who brewed coffee and stocked shelves during quiet afternoons. She said plenty of trucks idled at that turnout, but she remembered a white day cab sitting without a trailer once. Karen produced a spiral notebook where she kept odd notes to settle change disputes and lottery recollections. On a page dated 2 years back, she wrote, "Night truck, no trailer, short man, hat, hands shaking, paid in cash for cigarettes." She told them the man left a toll receipt on the counter by accident, then grabbed it quickly and stuffed it into his jacket. Ortiz photographed the notebook and asked about timing, and Karen said she wrote the note after midnight while the bell still echoed. She admitted she might be off by 20 minutes, but she remembered the man said something that felt like a warning. He said the word toll like it mattered. Then he asked if anyone was working late at the bridge control shed. The bridge control shed sat above the river, spanned 3 miles east, where cameras watched traffic and signboards scrolled travel times. Ortiz called a former technician named Orville Pacheco, age 62, who kept his own notes in a faded green ledger. He said he logged an unexpected visit that same night. When a man in a reflective vest asked for camera reset access, Orville said the visitor showed a badge sleeve without a badge, which made him cautious, and he refused to grant access. He called the after-hours line to report a vendor mismatch, and the line recorded his message with the time he spoke. The line, according to archived records, Ortiz had already pulled, captured footsteps, a door-open sound, and muffled traffic noise. They returned to the turnout while the drone lifted into a steady grid pattern, and Ortiz asked Dorian for his honest read. He believed the receipt had stayed near that lip for months, then shifted forward during a recent heavy storm last spring. The spidering of dirt on the paper edges matched the way silt moves when culverts push water hard toward daylight. The drone operator flagged a heat anomaly under the slope where the grease ribbon angled into brush and sage. A buried object held temperature longer than the surrounding dirt, and its shape suggested a long chassis with a missing rear section. Dorian stared at the screen while Ortiz arranged a small excavation crew and a wrecker with a winch and safety chains. The bucket peeled turf like old cloth, revealing crumpled metal painted white and a scraped cereal plate near a crushed step. The cab had separated from a frame that showed clean-cut ends, not torn ends, and Dorian felt his stomach tighten hard. The clean ends suggested someone removed the trailer hardware with purpose, then eased the cab down the slope intentionally. Ortiz called the medical examiner and the state commercial unit, then stepped away to speak to a number marked confidential. She returned with a firm face and told Dorian she needed one more favor while crews secured the scene. She asked him to drive to the scrapyard 2 exits west, where way logs sometimes kept more truth than anyone expected. At the yard, a supervisor named Harlan Voss, age 55, carried a tablet loaded with camera stills and cash tickets. He said people brought cut frames to his scale weekly, and he flagged one ticket dated 3 days after the reported outage. The still showed a flatbed hauling a truck frame section without a cab, strapped tight with chains and cheap ratchet binders. The driver wore a reflective vest, a hat pulled low, and gloves that looked new, and his hands seemed unsteady at the counter. Harlan remembered the hands because the driver dropped a toll receipt while counting bills, then apologized like he was late for something else. The camera caught the corner of the paper, and the blue stripe matched the one on Dorian's find. Ortiz requested the original video and the ticket, then compared plate numbers with the state registry and commercial inspections. The plate belonged to a hauler who reported his flatbed stolen for one night, then found it returned with fresh chain marks. He never filed a full report because the trailer came back clean, and he feared insurance delays could wreck his month. Piece by piece, a picture formed that did not look like a ghost or a river taking what it wanted. A driver left a warehouse near midnight, stopped at the turnout, and met someone who needed the cab but not the frame. The someone posed as a camera contractor, killed a low-priority feed, then arranged to hide a cab where eyes rarely linger long. The twist came from a small sticker inside the cab roof, which a trooper peeled away from dust with a gentle thumb. It showed a fleet service company that kept neat records, including oil changes, mileage notes, and a knack for precise dates. Their files showed work performed 2 weeks before the disappearance, and the mechanic wrote a side note about a key copy. The mechanic wrote that a third key was requested by a man who said he was the night dispatcher, and he paid in cash. The mechanic thought nothing of it until Ortiz called. Then he remembered the man never signed the usual authorization line. The shop camera showed the man wearing a vest like a contractor, and the badge sleeve again appeared strangely empty. Ortiz pulled toll plaza footage from the night in question and synchronized it with the scrapyard stills and the bridge notes. The day cab crossed the plaza as expected, and the timestamp matched the receipt tucked in the culvert lip. The truck exited near the turnout, camera glare washed the lane, then resumed with a frame that missed a single clear license view. Witness statements placed a white day cab idling without a trailer, and a clerk recorded restless hands that left a paper corner. A technician refused an access request, and a maintenance line captured footsteps and a door open sound after the call ended. A stolen flatbed left and returned in a narrow window, and a cut frame crossed a scale with a driver who spoke softly. The medical examiner recovered remains from the cab, and dental records from a previous injury matched a profile kept by his dentist. The family received a closed answer shaped like sorrow rather than speculation, because speculation had gnawed at them for years. The drywall load had been simple, the route had been familiar, and the end had hidden in a slope beside a lonely turnout. Motive came faster than Dorian guessed, and it turned on a small insurance clause that rewarded a competing carrier. The person posing as a contractor had worked for that carrier briefly, then left a digital trail of stolen dispatch templates. He understood cameras, toll patterns, and how to bend the timing of people who worked graveyard shifts with tired eyes. Ortiz did not say solved aloud in front of anyone, and she used the gentle phrasing investigators save for families who have waited. She told them the discovery was due to a maintenance worker who kept notes, who walked slowly, and who refused to shrug. She mentioned the receipt that waited in a lip everyone missed, and she promised it would be handled with care. A week later, Dorian returned to the turnout with a new grate and a broom because he wanted the place to look tended. He replaced the odd bracket with the correct plate, tightened the bright bolt, and brushed the concrete until the dust lifted. Cars hissed past, and a train horn carried from somewhere distant, and the ditch water moved with a plain, steady sound. He thought about simple, measurable things as he loaded the cones and folded his checklist, and the tune finally came back. His father used to whistle that tune while changing oil in a gravel driveway under a high summer Sunday. He stood quietly, listened to wind in the pines, and let the ordinary noise of the road remind him why details matter. Karen's notebook went back under the counter, Orville's green ledger returned to a shelf, and the scrapyard ticket stayed scanned. The river cameras got a new maintenance sticker with a fresh signature line, and technicians added a habit of requesting 2 verifications. The county posted a small plaque at the turnout with no names, only a line about patience and careful work. When Dorian passed that spot after later storms, he slowed as a reflex, and he watched small things settle where gravity pointed. He understood that places remember without meaning to, and that a crumpled paper can hold a night in its faded stripe. He started stopping for coffee at the store more often, just to say hello and to count the steady ring of the doorbell. The road kept moving, trucks kept downshifting on the grade, and the turnout regained its ordinary shabbiness in summer heat. Dorian did not tell the whole story to anyone at the diner, and he did not dramatize what the cable hooks revealed. He kept the memory in the quiet pocket of workdays, where tools sat cleaned in their tray and notes lined up square. There was no miracle in any of it, only a patient chain of human attention passed hand to hand without ceremony. The receipt was not miraculous either, it was simply patient, wedged where water and wind forgot to sweep. A missing driver got his name back in a single sentence, and a family traded uncertainty for grief that could finally breathe. Years will pass, and that turnout will keep catching wrappers and leaves, and a worker will kneel to clear them. Someone will hum without knowing why, and maybe remember how a small slip of paper can outweigh a rumor. The place will not speak, yet it will still hold that long night in the print of its concrete, quiet as a held breath. Dorian drove away as shadows crossed the lane markers and the orange hood flashed twice in the side mirror. He felt lighter and heavier at the same time, which is how truth can sit after it finally finds a home. He did not chase the tune anymore, and he did not rush the checklist, because patient work had already taught him what mattered today. He believed there were other receipts under other lips somewhere, and he hoped other hands would take them gently. He kept his camera roll tidy, his gloves clean, and his pencil sharp enough to write down what needed remembering. The turnout stayed ordinary when he left, but the ordinary held a story now, and that felt exactly right. The town that locked its gates at sunset. Residents of Graybridge in Skagit County, Washington, described a routine that rarely drew attention until the winter of 2019. Every evening, near civil twilight, the municipal swing gates at the north and south arterials were rolled shut and locked. The practice dated back to a flood mitigation plan that repurposed surplus highway barricades as neighborhood barriers. People accepted the ritual as ordinary, and few questioned who kept the keys or why the schedule never shifted. When an unexpected series of incidents clustered around closing time, the pattern became the story itself. The first documented night belonged to Everett Lang, 58, Public Works Maintenance Supervisor, on call to verify generator levels. He drove the service pickup along the riverfront approach while watching barometer readings fall and the wind stir powdered snow. According to dispatch logs, he radioed that the western gate lamp flickered despite a recent bulb change. He parked beside the frame at 4:21 p.m., marked the hinge plate with chalk, and indicated he would return a socket set. State records show his time card ended at 4:29 p.m., though the truck remained on site until after dark. In interviews recorded later, several drivers said the gate looked closed before sunset, which was unusual given the posted schedule. A school bus turned early, leaving 2 students to walk the long frontage path in rising wind. The bus contractor filed an incident note, and the county file from 2009 was cited to explain alternate routes. That file referenced water on roadway conditions during king tides, not early closures or padlock changes. Investigators never confirmed why the chain was moved one slot tighter on that particular evening. 2 nights afterward brought a second account from Mara Jensen, 33, substitute teacher, visiting a friend in town after a late shift. She reported the southern gate partially open at 4:47 p.m., with the reflective panel rocking slightly and then stilling as if held. Some locals claimed she misread wind gusts against the sign face, though the crosswind was recorded as modest. Jensen stated she called the non-emergency line and left a message describing a figure near the hinge post. Archived notes indicate no callback and no official sighting recorded that week. Graybridge had reasons to prefer early closures, including opportunistic dumping on the river pullouts during shoulder seasons. Yet council minutes show the adopted ordinance framed the gates as temporary storm furniture, not nightly perimeter control. The language specified seasonal deployment during marine layer advisories and elevated creek stages. In practice, the town applied the hardware every evening from October through March, then loosened schedules without a written addendum. Records conflict on who authorized the habit, and signatures on renewal notices rotate among 3 clerks. On the last Friday of November, the wind eased and the river flattened under an inversion haze that kept sounds oddly near. Everett returned with a junior technician to adjust the sticking hinge on the western frame. They noted ripples on pooled water inside the shoulder that looked like traffic vibrations without any visible vehicles. The technician logged a vibration test with a wrench against the post and marked slightly dull resonance. Minutes later, the gate swung with a slow finish despite grease on the bearing surfaces, and the lock clasp settled without a rattle. That same hour, Deputy Colin Ward, 47 County Sheriff's Office, ran a patrol loop that included the northern approach. He observed families cutting across the gravel to reach the diner before the gate closed, moving with the practiced timing of regulars. Ward kept a neutral pace, logged plate numbers, and waved two teenagers through the opening with a small vertical hand motion. He later wrote that the gap appeared exactly the width of a compact car mirror span, which struck him as intentionally measured. Reportedly, he considered waiting by the hinge but diverted to a noise complaint near the mill. December brought earlier darkness, and the gates began meeting the sun halfway on clear days that should have stretched the schedule. A hardware store owner said the padlocks sometimes felt warm even in freezing air, then cooled quickly when exposed. A fisheries volunteer said the river sounded less present near the metalwork, like a muffled channel on a radio. Another resident described 3 short knocks from the empty lane that made a dog pull hard toward the ditch. Investigators never confirmed a single physical cause, and weather data offered only modest anomalies. Attention sharpened after a delivery driver photographed the southern gate with the chain fastened through a hole that did not exist earlier. The image shows a neat circle in the panel skirt, clean-edged, free of burrs, positioned where the angle iron meets the cross brace. Public Works said no one issued a work order and the spare panel in storage had no matching hole. Some locals claimed the photo captured glare rather than new metalwork, though the exposure time was short and the light soft. Archived notes include a printout marked question feature with no follow-up entry. During the first week of January, a light snow covered the approach lanes and kept tracks readable until the plow made its pass. A single set of boot prints approached the western gate from inside town, stopped at the hinge side, then angled away toward the river footpath. The returning path never crossed back toward the lane, and the tracks faded where wind scoured the edge berm. Dispatch logs record Everett calling the footprint pattern in, requesting guidance before opening the frame for the morning commute. Ward logged arrival 8 minutes later and photographed the sequence from 4 angles with flash reflection on the chain. Ward's report states the hinge bolt showed a bright ring where recent friction removed road film. He measured the chain slack and counted links, arriving at a number that did not match the training sheet. The difference equaled 1 link, which could be explained by minor tension variations under cold conditions. He wrote that the padlock keyway pointed down when he left, a habit he maintained for rain management and quick checks. State records include the photo, and the keyway appears horizontal under direct flash. A week later, Jensen returned to town for a weekend district workshop and stayed at a friend's rental near the river. She walked to the store before sunset and paused by the southern gate after hearing a short metallic tap. She saw no vehicles and no pedestrians except a runner on the far path whose headlamp bounced steadily. Jensen described the tap repeating twice, followed by a faint hiss like air leaving a tire at a steady rate. She declined to give an interpretation and asked that her name be recorded without additional context. By midwinter, the gates closed at a time that residents could predict without consulting the posted sheet. Tourists missed the window and parked along the highway shoulder, then walked in under a sky that turned quickly from silver to blue. A volunteer ushered them along with a flashlight and instructed them to step clear of the hinge arc. Public Works kept a second set of keys inside a red box at the fire station and signed them out for emergencies. Reportedly, 2 keys went missing for a weekend, then returned without a log entry. Everett's final detailed entry came during freezing rain, when locks often seized despite preventative lubrication. He noted a ticking sound from the shackle area that reminded him of thermal snap in roof tin. He warmed the lock body with a portable heater and watched the built-up moisture steam away in a thin ribbon. The ticking continued for 30 seconds and then stopped without the usual follow-on rattle. He closed the gate and left the heater running while he checked the opposite frame under a flat gray sky. The following afternoon, a contractor found a child's mitten lodged between the latch plate and the panel rib at the northern gate. No missing child report existed, and the school confirmed perfect attendance for the relevant classes. Some locals claimed the mitten blew from a passing stroller and bounced into the gap during a brief gust. The knit fabric was dry despite earlier drizzle, which the contractor wrote felt inconsistent with the time on his delivery receipt. Archive notes show the item was placed in a lost property bag and never claimed. Ward conducted a simple experiment with a digital recorder, a tape measure, and a bag of sand to dampen vibrations. He placed the recorder near the hinge and opened the gate to the width used during the dinner rush. He listened to playback and heard 3 faint taps spaced evenly, each followed by a very low tone near the noise floor. He repeated the test on the southern gate and captured 2 taps and no tone. Dispatch logs note that he filed the recordings under equipment anomalies without linking them to any active case. A regional inspector visited after a minor collision, bent a reflector bracket, and sent a cyclist to urgent care. The inspector stated the frames met standard, the locks were common issue, and the postings looked adequate for winter conditions. He recommended painting the chain with high contrast bands so drivers could judge closure state at a glance. The town followed the advice and logged the paint purchase under safety materials, second quarter. Records conflict on whether the painter applied a primer coat that might have altered chain stiffness under cold temperatures. In late February, snowmelt filled the culverts, and residents described a hollow roar under the approaches at odd intervals. The gates continued closing near sunset, neither early nor late, as if synced to a clock hidden somewhere in the routine. A visiting journalist asked who owned that clock and received 3 different answers, including a vague reference to legacy timers. Public Works denied any timer beyond the wall calendar pinned above the parts shelf. Some locals claimed an older control box once existed, but no one produced a serial plate or a retired schematic. On the last documented evening before the spring schedule eased, Jensen walked with Everett along the river path after a school event. They discussed ordinary matters and kept their hands in their jackets while the temperature settled close to freezing. At the western gate, they heard a small clink like a coin touching metal without falling. Everett lifted the chain 1 link and set it down, and the sound did not repeat. He checked the latch face and saw a faint crescent in the dust, then wiped it clean with a sleeve. When daylight extended past commuting hours, the gates were rolled open and nested against their posts, and the town breathed differently. No ordinance changed, and no notice was printed, and the habit slipped away as quietly as it began. A few residents kept notes about the winter schedule, including times, weather, and small irregularities that never shaped into conclusions. State records contain everything necessary to describe the mechanics and almost nothing that fixes intent. The files remain available, and the keys hang on a peg behind a steel door with chipped paint. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The guard wrote down 8 distinct bouts of footsteps inside an empty building, and the cameras showed nothing all night. 2 separate motion sensors tripped near the same hallway, yet playback displayed a silent corridor with only the exit sign glow. His name was Barrett Lorme, 42, a night security officer at a regional logistics hub off a county road. The building sat between a rail spur and a belt of trees, and the company shipped auto parts and appliances. Barrett worked the 10 to 6 shift in a brown uniform that always smelled faintly of dust and coffee. He carried a flashlight, a radio, and a phone that hooked into a dispatch line, and he liked the quiet. He had a simple goal that Tuesday night in early spring, finish his rounds and sign off incident-free by dawn. He had brought a thermos of soup and a paperback, planning to spend the downtime in the small control room. He checked the weather and watched rain move in thin sheets across the lot lights. He thought about replacing his shoes, since the tread had started to squeal on polished tile. The incident started just after midnight, when he heard measured steps across the second-floor mezzanine. He was finishing a log entry about a storm alert, and the sound came clean and steady through the ceiling. He checked camera feeds for the mezzanine, but the screens showed still aisles and palleted boxes. He grabbed his light and his radio, and he headed for the stairs with the practiced calm of routine. At the mezzanine, he found that familiar quiet hum from the conveyors, a noise that never truly stopped. The footsteps repeated behind him, like someone matching his pace near the rail that overlooked receiving. He pivoted fast, saw only empty air and a red light blinking on a camera dome. He walked the length of the aisle while noting the time, and every time he paused, the steps seemed to pause. He logged the first occurrence at 12:15, wrote down the location, and continued his route. On the next pass, he heard them again near the battery storage closet. crisp against the concrete. He spoke into his radio, more for procedure than comfort, and announced that he was investigating a possible trespass. He found the closet locked and the seal unbroken, which did not help his nerves. From the control room, recordings later showed a hallway with nothing but reflected light pooling against steel doors. The microphones in that area were old and tinny, yet they caught a faint rhythm that matched walking. The time code on the feed read 12:18, which matched his scribbled note from the clipboard. He wrote a second entry because repeated anomalies meant paperwork, and paperwork meant patience. By 1:20, the steps had moved to the long corridor past the break room, and Barrett felt the hairs rise on his arms. He had switched to his backup flashlight after the primary started to flicker, which made the hallway feel longer. He called dispatch on the archived line and requested a patrol swing through the outer lot, which sounded more confident than he felt. The dispatcher logged it and told him to stay on channel, which he did while walking slow. Around 2, the rain intensified, and the roof drums sent soft rolls through the rafters that sounded like distant carts. Barrett tried to isolate the sound by standing still, counting under his breath, then moving again. The footsteps returned with the same cadence each time, never rushing, never trailing off, like a metronome following his heel. He marked the third and fourth occurrences, and the sheet started to look like a pattern. He started to reconstruct the history of the building in his head in that practical way that guards do when bored. The hub had been expanded twice, and the mezzanine had been added after the original slab settled. A retired manager once said the second floor carried sound, strangely because the joists had been spliced during a shutdown. That small detail stuck now because odd structure often equals odd sound, and odd sound confuses cameras. He decided on an internal check of maintenance records, so he dug into a filing cabinet near the back wall. He found a binder labeled Floor Vibration Studies, stamped with a date from 2009 and signed by an engineer. He skimmed line items and saw mention of a resonance under certain loads and a recommended brace that was never installed. He took a photo on his phone, more habit than plan, then heard the steps again behind the door. He opened the door fast and swung the light through dust and metal shelves, and nothing moved. He stepped inside, closed the door, and waited until the air felt heavier, then walked, which pulled the sound along like a shadow. He spoke low into his radio and said, "Test." And he heard a soft reply through the ceiling that sounded like his own voice. He marked the fifth occurrence, then circled the time twice because the echo trick felt wrong. Barrett called the shift supervisor at home, a man named Gilles, and left a calm message. He explained that sensors popped twice, cameras showed clear, but audio suggested movement that matched his pace. He asked permission to halt one conveyor and test the mezzanine with the motor silent, since noise masking can complicate readings. He set the phone down and sipped soup while rain hit the window like static. The lot patrol rolled in at 2:30, and a deputy named Ames checked doors with a bright light and gentle humor. Ames wore a jacket that looked older than the car, and he liked to tease Barrett about hobby detective work. He came inside, listened near the break room, and heard the steps when Barrett moved, then nodded like a man hearing an old song. He wrote a short note on a card and suggested they check the time sync on the cameras. Barrett pulled up the system configuration, and a small detail finally jumped out where he had not looked. The network video recorder had synced to a time source that shifted during a recent firmware update. The correct setting had moved to a secondary tab, and the cameras were drifting a minute and a half slow during overnight resets. He compared timestamps against the dispatch call log, and the mismatch explained one gap, but not all gaps. He pulled out old handheld footage from training drills, which he kept on a thumb drive for new hires. A clip from 2019 showed a tour up the same staircase on a quiet Sunday night. The trainer had mentioned that the mezzanine acted like a drum when a person moved near the expansion joint. In the background, steps mirrored the instructor in perfect time, and the camera, pointed into the void, recorded nothing but sound. Witness statements from shipping staff added another layer. Since people love to tell small tech stories when asked kindly, a forklift driver said the mezzanine cameras had been moved 2 years earlier after a near miss with a swinging hoist. The new angles covered the rails and aisles, but created a narrow dead zone where a parapet shadow swallowed detail. The guard had never noticed because no one had reported anything in that exact strip. At 3:15, Barrett and Ames did a careful test. Treating the building like a patient with a stubborn cough, Barrett walked 5 paces, paused, walked 5, paused, and Ames watched monitors and marked everything on a yellow pad. The audio track caught consistent taps that matched the shoes, and the video showed an empty frame right where the parapet shadow lived. The dead zone was only 3 feet wide, yet it covered the spot where the resonance amplified best. They tried the same thing with the conveyor powered down, and the pattern grew clearer and less masked. Without the motor hum, the sound felt sharper, as if the building had pulled back a curtain, yet the frame still looked clean. Ames snapped his fingers and said, "That right there is our ghost. If a ghost paid rent and liked stairs." Barrett smiled without meaning to, then told him he would still file the incident by the book. He went back to the maintenance binder and took a second photo of a page about a brace that was never installed. The engineer had recommended a crossmember at the joint to dampen a known frequency that matched walking strides. In one margin, someone had written a note about budget carryover that probably killed the fix with a shrug. He put that in his notes with a plain line that said, "Brace never added, resonance persists during light traffic." The sixth occurrence came while he wrote that sentence. Like the building wanted to underline the point, he recorded the time, then cross-checked it against the corrected system time on the recorder, and they finally aligned. He realized the worst part was not the sound, but the way uncertainty stretched time during long nights. He spoke aloud to the empty hallway and said, "That is enough now," which felt silly but oddly steadying. He kept investigating because good habits make future nights easier, which matters more than a single scare. He printed the camera layout and traced the dead zone with a highlighter, then labeled each motion sensor with its field of view. He checked battery dates because a dying sensor can behave like a jumpy cat, and both batteries were fresh from last month. He called the day supervisor and left a second message with a tighter summary. The seventh and eighth occurrences happened as a pair near 4, right when shift change trucks started rumbling past the fence line. The steps matched his route exactly. Yet the sound slid forward and backward based on where he stood near the rail. He pictured the mezzanine as a guitar body that needed a finger pressed lightly on a string to quiet a note. He thought about the brace again, and he made a final note that felt like an instruction. When Gilles called back just before 5, Barrett kept his tone normal and direct. Gilles asked if he needed an officer to sit inside until the sun came up, and Barrett said they were fine now. He explained the misaligned timestamps and the dead zone shadow and the resonance sheet that read like a forgotten to-do. Gilles sighed, then said to write it clean and attach the photos to the morning inbox. Barrett did that line by line, treating the log as a small map for the next person. He wrote that witnesses heard the sound during training in 2019 and that maintenance had never added the brace. He wrote that the camera angles needed a minor shift to close the dead zone near the parapet. He added that the network recorder needed a corrected time source to prevent drift during overnight resets. He included a note about the patrol deputy who observed the sound and saw clean frames. Because outside eyes help, he kept the language careful and dry, avoiding drama, sticking to facts he could show later without wobble. He attached phone photos of the binder pages, the highlighted camera layout, and his clipboard entries that matched the sensor alerts. He finished by recommending a temporary closure of the area until the brace could be installed. Sunrise cleaned the edges of everything, and the building felt ordinary again, which was a relief he did not say. The rain slowed, and a gull rode the wind over the rail spur, which made him laugh at himself for being jumpy. He locked the mezzanine door and placed a bright cone at the landing, because simple signals beat superstition every time. He poured the last of his soup into a paper cup and let the steam warm his nose. When the day shift filed in, Barrett handed the report to the receptionist and nodded to the warehouse lead. He told the lead to keep people off the mezzanine except for essential work, and the lead agreed with a tired salute. Ames waved from his car and drove off with the easy confidence of a man satisfied by a solvable problem. The place returned to its ordinary clatter, which was the best sound in the world that morning. In the weeks that followed, the company installed the missing brace and retuned the camera angles by a small degree. A contractor ran a new line to the time source, then logged the change and initialed the tab with a neat signature. The steps never reappeared in the same way, according to follow-up notes and archived calls from later shifts. Barrett replaced his shoes and kept working nights, because quiet had always been the goal. If anyone asked about the story, he told it straight, and he never padded the edges to make it spooky. He said that buildings remember their mistakes in the shape of their echoes, and a cheap fix can teach a loud lesson. He said that cameras can lie without malice if someone nudges their clocks or points them an inch left. He said that good logs can save an hour of fear, which felt true every time he wrote a line. By summer, the mezzanine felt like any other walkway. Not a drum, not a stage, not a mirror for footsteps. The report lived in a drawer with other small sagas of night work, each one patient and plain. Barrett liked that the truth did not need big words or legends, just careful notes and people who read them. He had found the sound and given it a reason, and the reason made the building quiet again. The stories. The quiet truth inside that coastal hospital wing. The hospital sat 2 blocks from the water, and the wing that faced the inlet stayed quiet through every busy shift. People joked about the sea air, then lowered their voices near that corridor like sound itself preferred to drift away there. On a mild spring morning, Leora Penn showed up with her coffee and a checklist, planning to finish safety checks before lunch. She was 34, and she worked as the environmental services supervisor, which meant she tracked odors, stains, leaks, and things nobody wanted to notice. She liked simple goals, like swapping cracked casters on linen bins before anyone tripped while rushing a patient. The storm last week flooded a basement stairwell, and today she wanted to log the final moisture readings and close the work order. Everything else could wait until the afternoon. Her plans changed before the first break. A nurse from the cardiac floor stopped her by the supply elevator and asked a question that landed with a small cold wait. "Did you move a bed out of 12 East overnight?" the nurse asked, because that room looked freshly mopped and nobody had the call light plugged in. Leora said no, then walked the nurse back to 12 East. The room held a made bed, smooth as a catalog photo, the kind of smooth that usually meant empty or staged. The call light cord curled like a quiet reminder, and the plug lay against clean tile. The monitor cart blinked in standby, which was normal if a discharge happened, which the board said had not. She pulled her phone and checked the overnight service log. The log showed a water alarm cleared at 3:12, plus a linen delivery at 3:28, and the standard generator test at 3:30. Nothing about a bed move. The floor techs had signed off at 4, which tracked with the rotation. She felt the wing hush in her ears as they stepped into the hall. The hush was not spooky, just oddly firm, like the sound of a theater after the speakers cut. She remembered 2 other techs mentioning the same hush months ago, which she had written down as acoustic weirdness from the renovation. The walls from the pre-1980 edition met the newer drywall at shallow angles, which could bend sound enough to make a whisper vanish. The nurse pointed down the corridor toward rooms 14 through 20, which were half full after the storm transfers. "You ever notice the alarms sound softer here?" she said, "even with doors open." That question turned a small worry into a task. Leora thanked her, then called Rafi Soto from facilities, who was 41 and worked nights on chillers and pressure monitors. Rafi said he could meet her after he ran a test on the pharmacy air handlers. She told him 12 East first, and to bring his handheld sound meter. While she waited, she checked the housekeeping closet and found a single wet mop hung wrong side up, which bothered her more than it should. The rag bucket held 5 clean tags, which meant 1 tag missing. She counted cart liners, then photographed the tag numbers, then texted her team group, which answered with the usual thumbs and jokes. Rafi walked in with his meter and a grin, then lost the grin when he heard the haul. He held up the meter while a monitor alarm chirped in room 16. The reading was lower than upstairs by real points, not just a little. He tried the code blue test switch on the mock panel, and the hallway speaker tone sounded like a phone in another apartment. They stood there for a quiet minute that stretched. She felt the cool push of air on her ankles, like a vent trying too hard. Rafi crouched and checked the gap under door 18, then looked at a ceiling return. "This wing was set for negative pressure during a flu surge," he said, "and someone forgot to return the dampers. That could pull sound into the duct runs." They both knew sound should not disappear completely, and hospital speakers had their own lines, but the observation mattered. Leora asked if maintenance logs showed damper positions. Raffi said the old building used manual marks with paint dashes after a storm, and sometimes those faded. He called his lead, who checked archived notes from winter. The notes reportedly listed a temporary negative pressure setting for isolation overflow and a reminder to reset after discharge. The reminder had no follow-up check line, which could be simple human miss and not a cover for anything worse. Still, the room felt staged wrong. Leora walked back to 12 East, then took photos of the made bed from 3 angles, partly habit, partly evidence. She opened the closet and found a folded patient gown without a size sticker, which was nothing by itself. She checked the Sharps container seal, then stepped into the bathroom and looked at the floor drain for silt patterns. The ring looked clean in a way that suggested a recent rinse, not a final deep clean. She called central coverage and asked if a float nurse had swapped rooms overnight. The charge nurse checked dispatch logs for bed control and found a 1-minute call at 3:29 that dropped before anyone spoke, which felt like a butt dial or a cold finger hitting end. The caller ID showed the station handset in this wing. Leora went to the security office and asked for hallway footage. The officer on duty, a patient man named Colm Reyes, 37, pulled the clip from 3:15 to 4. They watched the split screens without commentary. At 3:17, a linen cart rolled in from the elevator without a staff badge visible. The cart moved slowly, with one wheel catching, which matched the caster she meant to swap today. At 3:19, the cart paused outside 12 East, then shifted, then kept moving toward the end of the hall. They watched for the badge reader hits that should flank every elevator entry on that floor. The system registered 1 badge at 3:14 from Raffi earlier, and 1 at 4 from a night nurse, and none for the cart. Cullum explained that carts come up with drivers who badge at the service basement, then sometimes ride with a different staffer when floors swap loads. That could account for the missing badge, and also could not. They checked the service elevator camera and caught the same cart doors sliding open at 3:16. The elevator captured a slice of reflective plastic and the edge of a sleeve, no clear face, and the time overlay blinked because of the generator test. The overlay sync had drifted last week, which Cullum was already fixing, which meant timestamps needed cross-checks against other clocks. Leora asked for a still from the moment the cart paused at 12 East. Colm printed a page with the grainy frame that showed the cart handle and a sliver of the room placard. She carried the print back to the wing and held it near the door under the light. The sliver matched the height of the placard, which confirmed little, but the angle of the cart showed the handle turned inward, which delivery staff rarely did when rolling past. She took out her moisture reader and checked the wall behind the bed. The numbers showed dry, which fit the recent mopping. She checked the strip beneath the bed casters and saw a thin gray smear that did not look like dust. She swabbed it with a clean wipe and noted a faint powdery drag on the cloth, not slippery like floor finish. She sent the wipe to Central Supply with a note asking for a basic powder test, which was really a habit from her last job at a larger facility. In that job, she once traced a peculiar residue back to construction dust tracked from a blocked stairwell, which explained an odd cough cluster that week. She had learned that small housekeeping notes sometimes solved problems everyone else framed as strange luck. By late morning, she had a sketch of the corridor on her clipboard with marks for return vents and speaker positions. Raffi walked the ceiling path and found a junction where 2 return lines met above room 15, which could create a pressure sink if one line pulled harder. He said he would check the damper blades for manual marks, then pulled down a tile and sighed at a rusted screw. "This wing is like a ship that forgot how to float," he said, which she appreciated. A nurse from 19, an older man named Keaton Ward, 49, stopped by and mentioned something from winter. He said he heard a voice on the hall speaker one night that sounded like a whisper on a phone. Just one word that might have been wait. He filed the report with his supervisor and chalked it up to a bleed from the intercom test. He offered to show his written statement, which he kept in a folder because he kept everything. His statement matched the time when isolation overflow ended, which lined up with the damper story. Leora worked through lunch and built a timeline with the clearest markers. The service log showed an alarm at 3:12 and a linen event at 3:28. The call log showed a 1-minute station call at 3:29. The camera showed a cart at 3:19 by the hall feed with a possible overlay drift. The badge system had no hit at the elevator at 3:16, likely because of a basement badge only. None of that explained the made bed and the unplugged call light. She checked the oxygen cylinder rack in the utility room and counted 2 empties in the wrong slots. The exchange sheets said 4 full arrived yesterday afternoon, with 2 used overnight in rooms 17 and 20. That math should yield 2 full and instead showed 1, which could be a miscount or something more routine, like a cylinder staged for respiratory and not logged. She asked respiratory, who checked their sheet and said they had pulled 1 extra for a transfer that ended up canceled, and that the cylinder sat by a stairwell for 10 minutes while a therapist helped a patient. The therapist sent a note with the time, which was 3:25, which touched the period where things felt odd. By mid-afternoon, Central Supply texted back a photo of the wipe with a small note. The powder fluoresced under a standard light test in a way that fit with foot powder or a powdered latex glove residue, not construction dust. That pointed back toward a human routine, not a leak from upstairs. The note did not accuse a person, and it did not need to. She went back to 12 East and sat in a guest chair and listened. She heard the sea through glass and vents, a soft hush without rhythm. She leaned forward and spoke into the empty room, a simple line that felt like testing a bridge. If anyone adjusted your alarms to keep the peace, I will put them back where they belong. Rafi returned with a small rag of paint, marked with faded red dashes. He had found the damper blades set to a position used during winter isolation, which explained part of the quiet. He reset the blades to neutral, then ran the test tone again. The hallway speaker sounded like a real alarm finally, and 2 nurses popped their heads out with startled faces, which reassured her and annoyed them. They still had to explain the made bed and the unplugged cord. She checked the discharge board again and found no new names, just a morning transfer to imaging. She pulled archived calls and found another brief call at 3:31 from the same station that ended without audio, which now looked like someone purging a stuck line. Column radioed that he found a maintenance note from Winter that instructed staff to purge stale intercom channels after negative pressure resets, which nobody had repeated since. They called the linen contractor and asked about the overnight driver swap pattern. The contractor said his drivers usually wheel carts onto the elevator and ride to the target floor, but during generator tests, they sometimes stop 1 floor early and let a staffer guide the cart to avoid stopping between floors. He checked his dispatch sheet and found a driver note that said elevator stopped short during test, staff pushed to 12, all good. He could not give a name, only the time block. By late afternoon, the picture sharpened enough to make sense without drama. A generator test overlapped with a linen delivery and a damper setting that muffled alarms. A staffer moved a delivery cart, paused by 12 East, noticed the mop bucket, pushed the cart aside, and quickly mopped a spill. The staffer made the bed to help, then forgot the call light plug during the rush. The unplugged cord did not match best practice, which would be fixed with a reminder, not a report that accused anyone. The part that still bothered her had to do with the oxygen cylinder timing and the extra pause by the stairwell. She asked Colm to pull stairwell footage if available, which he did, and showed a therapist propping the door while holding a cylinder with one arm and shepherding a patient with the other. The patient looked steady, which matched a canceled transport returning to bed. The moment accounted for the missing cylinder, which returned to the rack at 3:43. She closed her notebook and wrote an incident review in plain language. The review recommended returning dampers to neutral after surge events, verifying hallway speaker levels during generator tests, and making a fast rule about plugging call cords before remaking any bed. She added a line about how lavender air freshener should stay out of patient rooms because it could mask odors that indicate a problem. She always added that line, and sometimes it stuck. Before she left the wing, the nurse from earlier walked up with a small, tired smile. "So, not a haunting," she said. "Just a lot of people doing 3 jobs at once." Leora nodded and answered with the calm confidence of someone who had stared at too many messes that looked like mysteries. "It is pretty much always the simple chain," she said, "and sometimes the chain gets quiet enough that nobody notices the missing link. That evening, after the emails went out, she stood by the loading dock and watched the inlet. The tide came in without hurrying, and the gulls wrote slow lines across the air that nobody would ever read. The wing would sound normal tomorrow, which meant patients would hear every beep that mattered, and staff would hear every page that counted. The quiet truth had not been a ghost, or a cover, or a headline. It had been dampers, timing, human judgment, and a hallway that swallowed sound for a while. She locked the dock door and tucked her clipboard into her bag. She would never tell the story with flair, because the unsung fixes never loved applause. She would remember the hush, though, and the way it taught her to trust the boring explanations first, then test them anyway. In a building stacked with lives and wires, truth rarely shouted. It arrived like a tide in a coastal wing, steady and patient, and loud enough once you fixed the vents. The abandoned cabin at Lake Minchumina. A quiet airstrip, a frozen lake, and an unclaimed cabin drew 3 people into a chain of disputed facts. Dana Holt was 41, a wildlife biologist from Fairbanks, sent to map willow stands around Lake Minchumina for browse surveys. She carried a handheld GPS unit, a laminated grid map, and a notebook stamped with state records inventory marks. Her assignment reportedly tied to a late winter moose project funded by a regional habitat grant from Anchorage. Dispatch logs later noted her gear list, including a borrowed sat phone with a weak interior signal. The plan put her 2 nights lakeside, with a 3rd day for interviews in the village. Trevor Pike was 58, a bush pilot out of Nenana, flying a well-kept Cessna on skis toward the long white lake. He hauled fuel barrels, food boxes, and the biologist's duffel inside a strapped canvas pod for weight balance. Archived notes from his mechanic mentioned fresh spark plugs, a carb heat check, and a recent cylinder compression test. He told friends he liked the run across low spruce because the flat light taught careful judgment. Some locals claimed he kept a copy of County File from 2009 in the hangar, though investigators never confirmed that. Mara Kovic was 33, a seasonal ranger based near Denali Park headquarters, riding snow machine for a cabin stewardship check. She logged cabin conditions, counted split firewood, and photographed stoves for safety compliance with a borrowed office camera. Her unit followed a written route that skirted the lake edge and crossed a marked portage used by winter travelers. The cabin at the lake's western reach appeared on her sheet as unused, though records conflict on the maintenance code. She planned to verify the lock, then continue north toward an old trapline shed. The cabin itself sat low in thin spruce, its roof scabbed with scrap metal and patched plywood from earlier seasons. A dock beam lay buried in snow with iron spikes that showed orange despite fresh powder and wind crust. Windows were covered with sheet tin, while one pane held a sagging plastic film stapled into frozen trim. A stovepipe rose, bent and scarred, suggesting a fall or awkward repair that never fully seated. Nearest tracks curved from the lake glare to the trees, then vanished into a wind-stripped swale. Pike landed before noon, set his skis near the hard line of the windrow, and watched crystals skate across the surface. He idled past a pair of snow berms and shut down with the prop horizontal, then stepped onto the snow with a practiced swing. The air sat dry and flat, and the tree line worked like a low fence against the distant hills. He saw the cabin shape through willow and alder stems, and he waved toward a dark doorway he assumed stood open. According to dispatch logs, his final radio call reported safe arrival and stable conditions. Holt skied from the drop point toward willow clusters flagged on her grid, pausing to measure stem height and browse scars. She wrote times that matched the sun's slow wheel across pale cloud, and she made notes on minor moose trails crossing drifts. Snow settled around her knees where the crust failed, and a dry squeak sounded where sleet grains spilled under her poles. Her GPS line wavered along the bank, then cut inland to avoid pressure ridges near the lake's midsection. State records later matched her coordinates to a low bench of black spruce and open willow. Kovic reached the lake's western edge near afternoon, where the wind pressed a clean glaze across the old trail. She idled her machine and lifted goggles, then checked the map case that held laminated sheets with numbered cabin codes. Her photographs showed a dark rectangle among cramped trunks, the near wall patched with mismatched planks and weathered screws. She logged time, temperature estimation, and the presence of one snow-packed step leading to the door seam. Investigators never confirmed whether her GPS waypoint uploaded immediately due to weak signal near the trees. The door stood closed, but a thin line of snow had drifted against the threshold, which suggested no recent exit. Kovic brushed the seam and pressed the handle, then paused when the wood shifted and a smell of old ash slipped out. Inside, light fell through a tear in the plastic, showing a rough table and a stove flecked with rust. A nailkin sat on the floor, half full of screws, and a spool of braided line rested beside a chipped mug. She wrote that nothing looked stolen, though records conflict about the status of a missing tool roll. Pike dragged fuel drums from the sled and stowed them near an alder line, and he marked each top with grease pencil. He strapped one box with canned beans and pilot bread onto a child's toboggan he kept for makeshift hauling. His boot tracks crossed an older trail that drift had softened, and the prints filled slowly as gusts pushed through the scrub. He followed the trail to the cabin edge, then lifted a glove against the window gap to block the glare. According to archived notes, he later mentioned a shape like jackets piled low along the far wall. Holt circled back toward the lake for new bearings, then saw a narrow flag of smoke pull sideways above the tree line. She clipped her notebook shut and worked back along her inbound track, and the smoke thinned as she crossed a hollow. A faint hammer sound carried through the cold, 1 and 2. Then a pause, then one again in careful pace. She told a recorder later that wind tricked distance and the sound came from ahead at the willow fringe. Dispatch logs list a call from her sat phone that broke before a location could transmit. Kovic noted the stove held cooled ash shaped like close-grained fans, which sometimes form after slow overnight burns. She saw 2 bed frames without mattresses and a plastic tub of nails beside a broken lantern with a missing globe. A shoestring tied around a shelf post held a cluster of labels with faded writing and a smeared date in blue. She wrote it as midwinter, though investigators never confirmed the writing due to moisture damage that lifted the ink. Her photos show a floor scuff that turns at the threshold and stops under the hinge shadow. Pike knocked and stepped to the doorway, then waited while his eyes adjusted to the low light and muted colors. The ranger nodded and pointed at the scuffed floor, and he answered with an open palm toward the stove and table. He set the food box on the bench and tugged a corner of the plastic on the window to let air pass. The plastic snapped at one brittle crease, and a thin clatter rolled across the boards until it settled near the foot. Archived notes remark that the sound resembled pellets falling through a funnel, which matched small screws. Holt arrived as clouds thickened, set her poles by the door, and counted 3 sets of prints arranged in a loose chevron. She wrote that one trail ran from the lake to the door, and another crossed from south to west without clear origin. The third ran out toward the mid-lake glare, and its heel marks looked deep where crust had softened. She photographed a partial tread rib that looked commercial rather than custom, and the pattern resembled a hardware chain winter boot. State records later attached her images to a case file with conflicting captions and differing scale bars. The stove mouth held a curl of birch, which burned at the end like a lifted spoon and then fell. A few flakes of ash moved up the pipe seam, and a faint warmth hung 2 feet above the floorboards. Kovic said the cabin smelled like old smoke, not fresh, and she thought someone burned earlier and left. Pike disagreed and pointed to a brown ring on the stove lid where a pot's wet outline dried in an uneven halo. Investigators never confirmed any pot, and the photographs lack a matching circle on the table boards. They found a ledger book under the bench, wrapped in waxed paper that crinkled and tore when lifted free of splinters. The cover showed a stamped supply brand for flour, and inside a rough list of dates traced a column along the margin. County File from 2009 reportedly mentioned a similar cabin ledger used for shared caches among winter travelers. The dates here stepped through early winter into late January, then stopped abruptly without a name or a final note. Records conflict on whether a missing page existed, because the thread holes do not appear consistent, Outside, the lake made a hollow drumming as wind shoved crust into ridges that ticked against the skis and sled. Holt tested the crust and stepped toward the mid-lake track, which bent left and right like a cautious crossing. A shallow oval showed where someone placed a heavy bag and lifted it again, leaving granules pressed into the glaze. She measured the oval's length with her ski pole and wrote the number inside her notebook above a time mark. Dispatch logs later repeat that number with an error, which investigators never resolved after interviews ended. Pike followed the south trail along the tree line where low branches swept the snow and hid thin lines of travel. He saw a thumb-sized shard of clear plastic with a rolled edge, which looked like a lantern piece with frost glaze. He placed it on a stump and marked a small circle around it with the ski tip, then turned toward the cabin again. The light dropped and the sky fell into flat shadow, which pushed contrast down until the trees felt closer. Archived notes suggest the shard later disappeared, and no inventory photo shows its presence. Kovic radioed a quick status to a regional repeater reporting cabin access, no apparent vandalism, and uncertain recent activity. Wind noise clipped her words and the signal dragged, then returned in a burst that carried only the timestamp. She closed the stove lid and reset the ledger on the bench, then photographed the plastic tear near the window frame. The cold sharpened and her machine coughed when she thumbed the primer, which she wrote as normal for that temperature. Investigators never confirmed the exact temperature, as the village reading differed from the lake's surface reading that evening. They agreed to leave the cabin secured and marked the location as potentially occupied within the last day, pending new snow. Holt wanted one more sweep near the mid-lake oval, and Pike offered to walk the edge while Kovic logged coordinates. Footfalls made short squeaks and a low creek where drift hid shallow overflow, and each step left a clean trench. They stopped at a second oval imprint that bore the same pole-measured length as the first near the glare. State records later argued the ovals could be gear rests from an auger or a short fuel can. Dark came quickly, and the trees lost edges, so they moved toward the airstrip where the plane sat, angled into the wind. Pike primed and pulled the prop through slowly, then climbed in and checked a panel glow that looked steady. The engine caught with a short puff and settled into an even sound that smoothed with carb heat after a careful count. Holt strapped into the right seat, and Kovic rode her machine along the edge until the light fell to gray. Archived notes describe no further radio calls from the lake until morning. Overnight, light snow reached the village and the lake, and morning tracks softened into shallow rolls by midday. A second ranger team reached the cabin from the north and found the door secured and the stove cold. They reported no ledger on the bench, and the nails sat in the can without the top layer that Kovic described. Some locals claimed wind pushed small things under gaps, and mice could drag paper toward cracks near the sill. Investigators never confirmed any mouse sign, and the photographs show only smooth dust along the baseboard. Holt filed her browse data in Fairbanks within the week, and the coordinates aligned with earlier moose counts from a prior winter. She included a short addendum about the ovals and the partial tread pattern that matched a commercial winter boot. State records acknowledged her note and attached it to a maintenance ticket for the cabin with a follow-up box. The ticket moved between offices, and records conflict about whether a later inspection occurred before thaw along the lake. A final entry closed the ticket in early spring with a single line about no hazard identified. Pike flew 2 more runs to the interior that month, and his logbook shows fuel consumption within normal range for the airframes. He wrote short comments about surface conditions near Minchumina, including 2 mentions of glare patches that made depth judgment difficult. Archived notes add that he left a spare belt and plug set with a friend at the Nenana hangar. Some locals claimed he removed the county file from 2009 from the shelf, though investigators never confirmed the timing. His last statement about the cabin said only that empty places keep their own time, which is not an opinion recorded as fact. Kovic finished her cabin route and submitted photographs, and her supervisor added captions and a brief summary for the binder. The caption under the plastic tear mentioned a likely weather-related failure of the film from prior patchwork. Dispatch logs show a short call from her to a friend near McGrath about icy trails and a slow return after a storm. She kept the route map with the laminated codes, and a later scan shows a faint pencil check beside the cabin square. Investigators never confirmed who made the check, and the binder copy prints the line with a light streak. Weeks later, village travelers reported two small stakes visible near the mid-lake line after a warm spell cut the crust. The stakes sat where the ovals had rested, and each held braided line tied in a simple hitch around the shaft. A small flag of cloth clung to one stake and tore free when pulled, leaving a short fringe of thread. Some locals claimed the cloth looked like shirt flannel, while others said it was a cut rag from a fuel wipe. Records conflict on color, and no sample appears in the final envelope attached to the case file. By summer, lake water pulled at the dock beam and lifted it slightly, showing spikes that caught sun beside floating moss. The cabin door swelled in the damp, and the plastic patch sagged where heat softened the staples along the frame. A new scratch marked the bench top, straight and pale, with fine dust settled at the far end near the ledger place. No ledger lay there, and the nails in the can showed a different arrangement than winter photographs from the binder. State records closed the seasonal report with a line that stated no further action pending future complaints. Autumn brought clear nights and sharp stars over the interior, and the lake edge hushed with thin ice before snowfall. The cabin sat in the same low posture among thin spruce, its stovepipe tilted and bent in familiar profile. Travelers passed on the portage and saw no light inside, and the door held fast against early wind. The ovals by the mid-lake line had filled and hardened, and the stakes fell flat under glare and frost. Dispatch logs for the region listed minor incidents only, and no entry referenced the cabin after the first snow. What remains are records that do not align, voices that differ on colors and smells, and photographs that miss small things. The cabin holds patched boards and a bent pipe, with a bench scar that means little without a missing book. Some locals claimed the place hosted caches that shifted among hands, but investigators never confirmed any schedule or written rules. There is a stove lid ring that might be a shadow, and footprints that waver between soft crust and uncertain depth. According to state records and archived notes, the cabin stands unclaimed at Lake Minchumina, and the file stays thin.